The silence before a storm is deceptive. In the mountains of Afghanistan, that silence lasted exactly 47 seconds before all hell broke loose. What happened next would challenge everything the military thought they knew about courage, protocol, and the limits of human determination. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a combat medic who made a split-second decision that violated every rule in the book and saved 17 lives in the process. Her leap from a helicopter into enemy fire wasn't just an act of defiance. It was the moment when one woman's refusal to accept defeat turned a massacre into a miracle. The brass called it reckless.
The soldiers she saved called it divine intervention. Maria Santos simply called it Tuesday.
The morning started like any other at Forward Operating Base Thunder, nestled in the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan's Kunar province. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos pulled her dark hair into a tight bun, the same way she had every morning for the past 8 months of her deployment. The mirror in her quarters reflected tired brown eyes that had seen too much. But her hands remained steady as she secured her medical kit. Today felt different somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Maria had grown up in East Los Angeles, where survival meant knowing when to fight and when to run. Her grandmother, Esperanza, had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when Maria was 12. Esperanza always said that God put people exactly where they needed to be, even when it didn't make sense. Standing in that cramped military quarter, thousands of miles from home, Maria wondered if her grandmother had been right. The base buzzed with its usual morning activity. Soldiers grabbed quick breakfasts of MREs and bitter coffee while checking their gear for the day's missions. Maria made her rounds through the medical bay, checking supplies and reviewing the condition of 3 wounded soldiers who had been brought in during the night. Private Johnson, barely 19, had taken shrapnel in his leg during a roadside bomb explosion. His eyes followed Maria as she changed his bandages, looking for reassurance she wasn't sure she could give. "How long until I can get back out there, Doc?" Johnson asked, using the nickname all the soldiers had given her despite her actual rank.
Maria smiled as she worked. "Your leg needs time to heal properly."
"Rushing back out there will only make things worse. But my unit needs me," he protested weakly. "Your unit needs you alive and functional, not dead or permanently disabled," Maria replied firmly. "Rushing back out there will only make things worse."
She had this conversation at least twice a week with different soldiers. The brotherhood among these men and women was so strong that they would rather risk their lives than let their teammates down.
It was admirable and terrifying in equal measure. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the medical bay doorway, his expression serious. "Santos, we need to talk." Maria finished securing Johnson's bandage and followed the captain outside. Rodriguez had been her commanding officer since she arrived at FOB Thunder, and she had learned to read his moods. Today, he looked worried in a way that made her stomach tighten. "We've got a situation developing about 15 clicks northwest of here," Rodriguez began, pointing toward the mountains that surrounded their base. "Alpha Company went out on patrol this morning to investigate reports of Taliban movement in the Korangal Valley. They were supposed to check in every hour." "When was their last communication?" Maria asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. 3 hours ago." Rodriguez rubbed his forehead, a gesture Maria had seen him make whenever he was trying to solve an impossible problem. "We've been monitoring radio chatter. It sounds like they walked into an ambush. The Korangal Valley had earned the nickname Valley of Death among American forces stationed in Afghanistan. The narrow valley provided perfect cover for insurgent attacks, with high ridgelines offering commanding views of anyone moving through the area below. Many patrols had been attacked there, but most had been able to fight their way out or call for backup. The silence from Alpha Company suggested something had gone very wrong. "What's the plan?" Maria asked. "We're putting together a rescue mission. 2 Blackhawks will carry a quick reaction force to extract whatever's left of Alpha Company. I need you ready to go in 30 minutes. Maria nodded and started to turn away, but Rodriguez caught her arm. "Santos, I need to be clear about something. We don't know what we're flying into. Intelligence suggests this ambush was well planned. There could be anywhere from 20 to 50 insurgents in that area. The rescue team will be walking into the same trap that got Alpha Company." "Understood, sir." "No, I don't think you do understand." Rodriguez's voice carried a weight that made Maria stop and really look at him. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen good soldiers make bad decisions because they wanted to be heroes. I've seen medics get themselves killed trying to save people who were already beyond help. Don't be one of those medics." Maria felt a flash of anger at the implication that she would be reckless, but she pushed it down. Rodriguez wasn't trying to insult her. He was trying to keep her alive. "I'll be careful, sir. See that you are. Alpha Company has 17 men.
If we lose the rescue team too, that's 23 families getting visits from casualty notification officers. I won't let that happen. On my watch.
30 minutes later, Maria sat in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter, surrounded by 8 members of the base's quick reaction force. The soldiers checked their weapons and equipment one final time as the helicopter lifted off from Fob Thunder. The familiar sound of the rotor blades provided a rhythmic backdrop to Maria's thoughts as she reviewed her medical supplies. She carried enough bandages, morphine, and surgical equipment to treat multiple casualties, but she knew that in a prolonged firefight, supplies could run out quickly. Her medical training had taught her to prioritize patients based on who was most likely to survive, a concept called triage that sounded clinical and reasonable in textbooks but was nightmarish in practice. She had already been forced to make those decisions twice during her deployment, and the memory of looking into dying soldiers' eyes still haunted her dreams. Sergeant Thompson, the team leader for the rescue mission, shouted over the noise of the helicopter. "Santos, when we touch down, you stay behind cover until we secure the area. We don't know what kind of resistance we're facing." Maria nodded, though she had already made up her mind to follow her medical oath rather than tactical protocol if it came down to a choice. Thompson was a good soldier, but he thought like a soldier. Maria thought like a medic, which meant wounded soldiers always came first, regardless of the tactical situation. The landscape below them shifted from the relative safety of the base area to the wild, mountainous terrain where Alpha Company had vanished. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. 5 minutes to landing zone. Maria closed her eyes and thought about her grandmother Esperanza, who had survived poverty, discrimination, and the loss of her son and daughter-in-law with a faith that never wavered. Esperanza believed that everyone had a moment in their life when they had to choose between the easy path and the right path, and that choice would define who they really were. Maria wondered if this was her moment. The helicopter began its descent toward the landing zone, a small clearing about half a mile from where Alpha Company had last been seen. Through the window, Maria could see the dense vegetation and steep ridgelines that made the Coronville Valley such a dangerous place to fight. Somewhere in that green maze, 17 American soldiers were either dead, wounded, or fighting for their lives. 2 minutes, the pilot announced. Thompson and his team chambered rounds into their weapons and prepared to exit the helicopter quickly once they touched down. Maria double-checked her medical kit one more time, making sure everything was easily accessible. In a few minutes, she would find out if months of training and 8 months of combat experience had prepared her for whatever waited in the valley below. The helicopter's nose flared up as the pilot began the final approach to the landing zone. Maria could see the second Black Hawk following about 100 meters behind them, carrying the rest of the rescue team. Everything looked normal from the air. Too normal, considering that somewhere nearby Alpha Company had walked into an ambush that had silenced their radios for 3 hours. 30 seconds, the pilot called out. Maria felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that came before every dangerous mission. She had learned during her previous combat experiences that fear was normal and even useful. It kept you alert and alive. But fear had to be controlled and channeled, not allowed to paralyze you when soldiers needed medical attention. The Black Hawk touched down in the clearing with a jarring thud, and Thompson's team immediately began exiting the aircraft. Maria waited for her turn, watching as the soldiers spread out to secure the landing zone. The sound of the rotor blades would have announced their arrival to anyone within miles, which meant they had lost any element of surprise they might have had. Thompson signaled for Maria to exit the helicopter, and she ran toward the tree line where the rest of the team had taken cover. The pilot kept the engines running, ready to take off at a moment's notice. The plan was simple: locate Alpha Company, treat the wounded, and get everyone back to the helicopters for evacuation to FOB Thunder. As Maria reached the tree line, Thompson was already trying to establish radio contact with Alpha Company. Alpha 6, this is Thunder Rescue Team. What's your status? Over. Static filled the radio for several seconds before a weak voice responded. Thunder Rescue Team, this is Alpha 27. Alpha 6 is down. We're pinned down by heavy fire approximately 800 meters northwest of your position. We have multiple casualties and are running low on ammunition. The voice belonged to Corporal Martinez, one of Alpha Company's squad leaders. Maria had treated Martinez for a minor injury 2 months earlier and remembered him as a steady, reliable soldier who didn't panic easily. If Martinez sounded worried, the situation was bad. Thompson studied his map and pointed toward a ridgeline that rose about 400 feet above their current position. They're up there pinned down on the far side of that ridge. We'll have to move through this valley and then climb up to reach them. Maria looked at the terrain they would have to cross. The valley floor was covered with dense vegetation that would provide cover from observation but would also slow their movement significantly. Worse, They would be moving uphill toward an enemy that had already proven capable of setting up effective ambushes.
Every tactical consideration suggested that this was exactly the kind of mission that resulted in rescue teams becoming casualties themselves. But 17 American soldiers were trapped on that ridge, some of them wounded, and all of them running out of ammunition.
There was no choice but to try to reach them regardless of the risks involved. Thompson divided his team into two groups and began moving toward the ridgeline where Alpha Company was trapped. Maria stayed with Thompson's group, carrying her medical kit and trying to ignore the voice in her head that kept whispering that they were walking into the same trap that had caught Alpha Company. The rescue team moved through the valley like ghosts, using hand signals and staying low to avoid detection. Maria followed Thompson's lead, her medical kit bouncing softly against her back with each careful step. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no insects. Just the distant sound of sporadic gunfire from the ridge where Alpha Company was trapped. 20 minutes into their movement, the first shots rang out. The crack of AK-47 rifles split the air, followed immediately by the heavier thump of a machine gun opening fire from somewhere up the slope. Thompson's team immediately dropped to the ground, seeking cover behind rocks and fallen trees. Maria pressed herself against a boulder, her heart hammering as bullets whined overhead.
"Contact left," Thompson shouted into his radio. Taking fire from the ridgeline, the Taliban fighters had been waiting for them, just as they had waited for Alpha Company.
The ambush was well coordinated, with multiple firing positions that created overlapping fields of fire. Every time Thompson's soldiers tried to move, bullets forced them back down into cover. Maria could hear Corporal Martinez's voice over the radio, reporting that Alpha Company's situation was getting worse.
They had been under fire for nearly 4 hours now, and their ammunition was almost gone. 2 soldiers had been killed in the initial ambush, and 5 more were wounded, including their commanding officer.
"We need to move," Thompson yelled over the gunfire. "They're sitting ducks up there." But moving forward meant crossing open ground under fire from an enemy that held the high ground. It was a tactical nightmare, the kind of situation that military planners tried to avoid at all costs. Thompson split his team again, sending 4 soldiers to provide covering fire, while he led the other 4 in a flanking movement around the left side of the ridge. Maria stayed with the covering fire team, but her mind was focused on the wounded soldiers trapped on the ridge above. Every minute they delayed meant more blood loss for the casualties, and blood loss meant death. She had seen too many soldiers die from wounds that could have been treated if medical attention had arrived just a few minutes sooner. The Taliban fighters seemed to have unlimited ammunition, keeping up a steady rate of fire that prevented any significant movement by the rescue team. Maria watched through her binoculars as Thompson's flanking element tried to work their way up the left side of the ridge, but they were forced to take cover when more insurgents appeared on the high ground. That's when Maria heard the sound that changed everything: a child crying. The sound was faint, almost lost in the noise of gunfire, but unmistakably human. Maria strained to locate the source of the crying and realized it was coming from a small building about 200 meters up the slope, directly between the rescue team's position and where Alpha Company was trapped. Sergeant Davis, who was lying next to Maria behind the boulder, heard it too. "What the hell is a kid doing out here?" Maria studied the building through her binoculars.
It was a typical Afghan farmhouse, built of stone and mud brick, with a flat roof and small windows. She could see movement inside but couldn't determine how many people were there, or whether they were civilians or combatants. The crying continued, joined now by what sounded like a woman's voice trying to comfort the child. Maria felt sick as she realized what was happening.
The Taliban fighters were using the farmhouse as a firing position, and there were civilians trapped inside. The insurgents knew that American forces would be reluctant to return fire if innocent people might be hurt.
Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. "We're pinned down on the left flank.
The bastards have us zeroed in from at least 3 different positions." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Alpha Company was running out of ammunition on the ridge. Thompson's team was trapped on the slope, and now civilians were in danger. Maria made a decision that would have gotten her court-martialed if anyone had known about it in advance. She keyed her radio and spoke directly to the helicopter pilots who were orbiting the area at a safe distance.
"Thunder 1, this is Santos. I need immediate extraction from the valley floor." "Negative, Santos," came the reply. "The landing zone is too hot.
"We can't come down until the area is secured." "I'm not asking you to land," Maria replied. "I need you to bring me up on a rope." There was a long pause before the pilot responded. "Say again, Santos." "Fast rope extraction from my current position."
"I need to get to that farmhouse to help civilians and establish a better position to treat casualties."
Thompson's voice cut across the radio frequency. "Negative!"
"Santos, you will not move from your current position. That's a direct order." But Maria was already moving. She had spotted a small clearing about 50 meters to her right where a helicopter could hover long enough to drop a fast rope. She sprinted toward the clearing, ignoring Thompson's increasingly angry commands over the radio. The sound of rotor blades grew louder as one of the Black Hawks responded to her request despite Thompson's protests. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Jenkins, had been flying combat missions for 8 years and had seen enough medics die trying to save people to understand what Maria was attempting.
Santos, this is crazy. Jenkins's voice came through her headset as she reached the clearing. The whole area is crawling with hostiles. Just get me close to that farmhouse, Maria replied, pulling on her fast rope gloves. I can help the civilians and get a better angle to treat Alpha Company's casualties. The Black Hawk appeared overhead, bullets striking its armored fuselage as Taliban fighters tried to bring it down. The door gunner returned fire, his machine gun chattering as he tried to suppress the enemy positions. A thick rope dropped from the helicopter's cargo door, swaying in the rotor wash. Maria grabbed the rope and began her descent, sliding down through the air as the helicopter hovered 40 feet above the ground. Bullets cracked past her, some close enough that she could hear their passage over the sound of the rotor blades. This was insane. Exactly the kind of reckless heroics that got people killed. But she couldn't think of any other way to reach the trapped soldiers and civilians. She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact and immediately scrambling toward the nearest cover. The helicopter pulled away, its door gunner still firing at Taliban positions. Maria found herself alone in the valley, with enemy fighters above her on 3 sides and a farmhouse full of civilians somewhere ahead. The crying child was louder now, mixed with the voices of what sounded like at least 2 adults. Maria could also hear movement inside the farmhouse that suggested the Taliban fighters were still using it as a position. She would have to be very careful about how she approached the building. Using the terrain to mask her movement, Maria began working her way toward the farmhouse. The Taliban fighters seemed focused on the rescue team's positions and hadn't noticed her helicopter insertion. She moved from cover to cover, pausing frequently to listen for any sign that she had been detected. As she got closer to the farmhouse, Maria could make out the words being spoken inside. She had learned some basic Pashto during her deployment, enough to understand that a woman was trying to calm a frightened child, while men argued in harsh whispers about something. One of the male voices was giving orders in the tone that suggested a military commander. Maria reached the back wall of the farmhouse and pressed herself against the rough stone. Through a crack in the wall, she could see inside the building. A young Afghan woman, probably in her 20s, was holding a boy who appeared to be about 4 years old. 3 Taliban fighters were positioned at windows facing toward where Thompson's team was pinned down. The woman looked terrified, glancing repeatedly at the fighters and then at the child in her arms. It was clear that she and the boy were not there voluntarily. The Taliban had taken them hostage to use as human shields, knowing that American forces would be reluctant to attack a building containing civilians. Maria studied the layout of the farmhouse through the crack in the wall. There was a back door that appeared to be unguarded, and the Taliban fighters were focused on their firing positions at the front windows. If she could get inside and neutralize the fighters without alerting others in the area, she might be able to rescue the hostages and establish a position from which to help Alpha Company. But first, she needed to let Thompson know what she had discovered. She keyed her radio and whispered into her headset, "Thunder Rescue Team, this is Santos. I'm at the farmhouse. 3 hostiles inside with 2 civilians, a woman and a child. The civilians are being used as human shields. Santos, get out of there now." Thompson's response was immediate and angry. "You have no business conducting a hostage rescue on your own." "I'm not conducting a hostage rescue," Maria replied. "I'm providing medical assistance to civilians in need." "But I need you to create a distraction so I can get inside without being detected." There was a long pause before Thompson responded. Maria could imagine him weighing his options, trying to decide between following protocol and trusting his medic's judgment. Finally, he came back on the radio. "Give me 2 minutes to get everyone in position. When you hear us open fire, that's your signal to move." Maria checked her medical kit and pulled out a syringe containing a fast-acting sedative. She wasn't carrying lethal weapons except for her sidearm, but she had medications that could incapacitate someone quickly if administered properly. It wasn't ideal for a combat situation, but it was better than nothing. Sound of gunfire erupted from Thompson's position as his team engaged the Taliban fighters on the ridge. The 3 fighters in the farmhouse immediately turned their attention to the windows, shouting commands to unseen companions elsewhere in the valley. Maria slipped through the back door of the farmhouse, moving as quietly as possible. The woman with the child saw her immediately and opened her mouth as if to scream. But Maria raised her finger to her lips and shook her head. The woman's eyes widened as she realized that Maria was there to help, not to harm them. The closest Taliban fighter was less than 10 feet away,
crouched at a window with his back to Maria.
She approached him carefully, syringe ready. Just as she was about to inject him, the man turned around.
For a split second, they stared at each other in mutual shock. Then the fighter reached for his weapon, and Maria lunged forward with the syringe.
They crashed to the floor together, struggling for control of his rifle. The other two fighters spun around at the sound, and Maria knew she had seconds before they opened fire. The woman with the child suddenly stood up and shouted something in Pashto. Whatever she said caused the two fighters to hesitate just long enough for Maria to inject the sedative into the first man's arm.
He went limp almost immediately, his eyes rolling back as the medication took effect. Maria rolled away from the unconscious fighter and dove behind a wooden table as the other two men opened fire.
Bullets splintered the wood above her head, filling the air with dust and debris. The woman grabbed her child and pressed them both against the far wall, screaming in terror.
This was exactly the kind of situation Thompson had warned her about. She was trapped in a building with armed hostiles, no backup, and civilians in immediate danger. But she was also the only person who could save the woman and child, and her position in the farmhouse gave her a direct line of sight to where Alpha Company was trapped on the ridge. Maria pulled out her radio and called for help, knowing that Thompson's team was still pinned down in the valley below.
Thunder Rescue Team, I'm inside the farmhouse with hostiles. I need immediate support. But even as she spoke, Maria was already planning her next move.
The two remaining Taliban fighters were focused on her position behind the table, which meant they weren't watching the woman and child. If Maria could create enough of a distraction, the civilians might be able to escape through the back door.
She pulled a smoke grenade from her belt and prepared to throw it toward the front of the farmhouse. Once the building filled with smoke, she would have a few seconds of confusion to work with. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than hiding behind a table while bullets chewed it to pieces. Maria pulled the pin from the smoke grenade and tossed it toward the front of the farmhouse.
Dense gray smoke immediately began filling the room, creating the confusion she needed. The Taliban fighters started coughing and shouting to each other, temporarily blinded by the thick cloud.
Run, Maria yelled to the woman in what little Pashto she knew. Back door!
Go.
The woman understood immediately, scooping up her child and stumbling toward the rear of the building. Maria provided cover by firing her sidearm toward where she thought the Taliban fighters were positioned, not trying to hit anyone but forcing them to keep their heads down.
As the woman and child escaped through the back door, Maria felt a moment of satisfaction. She had saved two innocent lives, but her situation was still desperate. The smoke would clear in less than a minute, and then she would be facing two armed fighters in close quarters with limited ammunition. That's when she heard Alpha Company's radio transmission that changed everything. Any friendly forces. Any friendly forces. This is Alpha 27. We have multiple urgent casualties and are about to be overrun. We need immediate medical assistance or we're going to lose everyone up here.
Corporal Martinez's voice carried a note of desperation that Maria had never heard before.
She peered through a crack in the wall toward the ridge where Alpha Company was trapped and saw muzzle flashes from what looked like dozens of weapons. The Taliban had committed significant forces to this ambush, and Alpha Company was running out of time. Maria made another decision that defied all military logic. Instead of trying to escape from the farmhouse, she decided to use her position to help Alpha Company.
The building was located halfway up the slope between the valley floor and the ridge, giving her a perfect vantage point to direct medical support. As the smoke began to clear, Maria spotted one of the remaining Taliban fighters moving toward her position.
She fired twice with her pistol, both shots missing in the poor visibility but forcing him back toward the window. The second fighter was somewhere else in the room, but she couldn't see him through the lingering smoke. Maria pulled out her radio and contacted the circling helicopters. Thunder 1, this is Santos.
I need you to listen very carefully. Go ahead, Santos, came the pilot's voice. I can see Alpha Company's position from the farmhouse.
They have wounded soldiers who need immediate evacuation, but the landing zone near their position is too hot for a normal approach. We already know that, Santos. That's why we can't get to them. But you can get to them if you approach from the northeast, using the ridgeline for cover. I can guide you in from my position. There was a pause before the pilot responded. Santos, are you suggesting that we conduct a combat medical evacuation in the middle of an active firefight guided by someone who's trapped in a building with enemy fighters? That's exactly what I'm suggesting. Maria replied as bullets started flying again inside the farmhouse. It's the only way to save those men. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of helicopters approaching from the north. But these weren't the American Blackhawks that had brought the rescue team. The distinctive sound of Soviet-era helicopters filled the air, and Maria realized that the Taliban had called in their own air support. Two Mi-8 helicopters appeared over the ridge, their door gunners firing down at Alpha Company's position. The American soldiers were now taking fire from above, as well as from the surrounding hills. Their situation had gone from desperate to hopeless in a matter of seconds. Thunder 1, you need to engage those helicopters before they massacre Alpha Company, Maria transmitted.
Negative, Santos.
We're not equipped for air-to-air combat.
We're medevac birds, not gunships. Maria watched in horror as the Taliban helicopters began dropping fighters onto the ridge near Alpha Company's position.
Soon, the American soldiers would be facing enemies on all sides, with no way to retreat and no ammunition to continue fighting. That's when she noticed something that made her heart race.
The farmhouse she was trapped in had a flat roof with a low wall around the edge. If she could get up there, she would have a clear view of the entire battlefield and would be able to provide much more effective guidance for the rescue helicopters. The only problem was getting to the roof while 2 Taliban fighters were still somewhere in the building with her. Maria looked around the smoke-filled room and spotted a wooden ladder leading to a trapdoor in the ceiling. The ladder was about 15 feet away across open ground where the Taliban fighters could easily see her. But it was her only chance to reach a position where she could effectively help Alpha Company. She took a deep breath and sprinted toward the ladder, firing her remaining rounds to keep the fighters' heads down. A burst of automatic rifle fire chased her across the room, bullets splintering the wooden floor at her feet. She reached the ladder and began climbing as fast as possible, expecting to feel bullets tear into her back at any moment. The trapdoor was heavy and stuck, requiring both hands to push it open. Maria hung from the ladder with one hand and shoved upward with the other, finally breaking the door free. She pulled herself through the opening onto the roof just as one of the Taliban fighters appeared at the bottom of the ladder. The man shouted something in Pashto and raised his rifle, but Maria was already rolling away from the trapdoor. She found cover behind the low wall that ran around the edge of the roof and immediately got on her radio. Thunder 1, this is Santos. I'm on the roof of the farmhouse with visual contact on Alpha Company's position. I can guide you in for a combat medevac. Santos, the situation has changed.
There are now enemy helicopters in the area and additional ground forces moving toward Alpha Company. This has become a full-scale engagement.
From her position on the roof, Maria could see the entire battlefield spread out below her. Alpha Company was surrounded on a small rocky outcrop, taking fire from at least 6 different positions.
The Taliban helicopters were circling overhead, pouring machine gun fire down on the trapped Americans. Bodies lay motionless among the rocks, and she could see wounded soldiers trying to crawl to better cover. I can see 5 wounded Americans who need immediate evacuation, Maria transmitted. If you approach from the northeast and stay low, you can use the terrain to mask your approach until the last second. Even if we could get in there, Santos, how do we get the wounded to the helicopter? They're pinned down behind rocks with no way to move. Maria studied the terrain around Alpha Company's position and realized the pilot was right. The wounded soldiers were trapped in positions that were too exposed for safe evacuation. They would have to be moved to a better location before a helicopter could pick them up. That's when Maria made the most insane decision of her military career. Thunder 1, I need you to drop a rope directly over my position. Say again, Santos. Drop a rope over the farmhouse roof. I'm going to fast rope down to Alpha Company's position and move the wounded to where you can pick them up. The silence on the radio lasted for nearly 30 seconds before the pilot responded. Santos, that is absolutely not going to happen. You would be fast roping directly into the middle of a firefight with no support, no way to get back out. Those soldiers are going to die if someone doesn't get medical attention to them in the next few minutes, Maria replied. I'm a medic. It's what I do. Below her on the roof, she could hear one of the Taliban fighters climbing the ladder toward the trapdoor. She had maybe 60 seconds before he reached the roof and opened fire. Even if she survived that encounter, Alpha Company was running out of time. Thunder 1, I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what needs to happen. Drop that rope in 30 seconds or watch 17 American soldiers die. The pilot's response came back immediately, filled with frustration and admiration. You're completely crazy, Santos. But you're right about those soldiers. The sound of rotor blades grew louder as one of the Blackhawks approached the farmhouse. Maria could see the crew chief in the cargo door, preparing a fast rope for deployment. The helicopter would have to hover directly over the building while enemy fighters shot at it from multiple positions. The Taliban fighters had appeared through the trapdoor just as the rope dropped from the helicopter. Maria grabbed the rope with one hand and drew her combat knife with the other. The fighter raised his rifle, and Maria did the only thing she could think of. She jumped off the roof. The 40-foot fall would have killed her if not for the rope, but even with it, the impact when she hit the end of the line nearly dislocated her shoulder.
She spun wildly as the helicopter fought to maintain position over the farmhouse, taking fire from the ground and struggling with the rotor wash bouncing off the building. "Get me over, Alpha Company!" Maria yelled into her radio. The pilot began moving toward the ridge where the American soldiers were trapped, carrying Maria beneath the helicopter like a human pendulum. Taliban fighters on the ground tracked their movement with automatic weapons, sending streams of bullets past the aircraft. As they approached Alpha Company's position, Maria could see the wounded soldiers clearly for the first time. Corporal Martinez was still fighting, but his left arm hung useless at his side. Private Collins was unconscious behind a rock, blood pooling beneath his head. Sergeant Williams was trying to apply a tourniquet to his own leg while continuing to return fire. The helicopter reached the edge of the rocky outcrop where Alpha Company was positioned and began to hover. Maria was still 40 feet above the ground, spinning slowly as she hung from the rope. The pilot's voice came through her headset. "Santos, I can't get any lower without crashing into the rocks. You're going to have to drop." Maria looked down at the rocky ground below. A 40-foot drop would probably kill her, but staying on the rope meant she couldn't help the wounded soldiers. She made her choice. "Tell my grandmother I love her," she transmitted, and then she let go of the rope. The fall lasted forever and no time at all. Maria hit the rocky ground hard, rolling instinctively to distribute the impact. Pain shot through her left ankle, but she was alive and conscious. More importantly, she was finally where she needed to be. "Medic," Corporal Martinez shouted over the sound of gunfire. "Doc, what the hell are you doing here?" Maria grabbed her medical kit and crawled toward the nearest wounded soldier, ignoring the bullets that cracked overhead. "I'm getting you guys out of here," she replied. "But first, I need to keep you alive long enough for pickup." The real work was just beginning. Maria's ankles screamed with pain as she crawled across the rocky ground toward Private Collins, but she forced herself to ignore it. Collins was unconscious, blood flowing from a head wound that looked far worse than it actually was. Head wounds always bled heavily, but this one hadn't penetrated the skull. She could save him if she worked fast. "Martinez," she yelled over the gunfire. "I need you to give me covering fire while I work on Collins." Corporal Martinez nodded and shifted position to get a better angle on the Taliban fighters who were advancing up the slope. His left arm was clearly broken, but he was still managing to fire his rifle with reasonable accuracy. The man was running on pure adrenaline and determination. Maria pulled out her medical supplies and began cleaning Collins's head wound. The bullet had grazed his skull, causing a concussion and significant bleeding, but no penetrating brain injury. She applied pressure bandages to stop the bleeding and administered a shot of epinephrine to help bring him back to consciousness. Collins's eyes fluttered open just as a Taliban fighter appeared at the edge of their position, rifle raised to fire at Maria. Martinez put 2 rounds center mass into the man, dropping him before he could pull the trigger. "Doc?" Collins mumbled, trying to focus his eyes. "What happened? You got your bell rung, but you're going to be fine." Maria replied while checking his pupils for signs of serious brain injury. "Can you move your arms and legs?" Collins moved all 4 limbs, confirming that he didn't have a spinal injury. Maria helped him sit up behind cover and handed him his rifle. "Think you can fight?" "Yeah, I think so." Collins's voice was still shaky, but he was functional. Maria moved on to Sergeant Williams, who was still trying to apply a tourniquet to his own leg. The wound was in his upper thigh, dangerously close to the femoral artery. If that artery was damaged, Williams would bleed to death in minutes despite any tourniquet. "Let me see that," Maria said, pushing Williams's hands away from the wound. She cut away his pants leg and examined the bullet hole. The round had passed through his thigh muscle without hitting any major blood vessels, but the wound was still bleeding heavily. Maria applied a proper tourniquet above the wound and gave Williams a shot of morphine for the pain. "How bad is it, Doc?" Williams asked through gritted teeth. "You're going to walk away from this one," Maria replied. "The bullet missed everything important. You'll be back to annoying sergeants in 6 weeks." Williams managed a weak smile, looking forward to it. The sound of the Taliban helicopters was getting louder, and Maria could see them preparing for another strafing run. Alpha Company's position was completely exposed from above, with no overhead cover to protect them from the door gunners. "Everyone get as low as possible," Maria shouted. "Those helicopters are coming back." The Taliban Mi-8 swept over the ridge, their machine guns chattering as they poured fire down onto the American position. Bullets sparked off the rocks around them, sending stone fragments flying through the air. One fragment caught Maria in the cheek, opening a small cut that immediately began bleeding. As the helicopters passed over, Maria got on her radio. "Thunder 1, those enemy helicopters are going to kill us all if you don't do something about them." "We're working on it, Santos." F-16s are inbound, but they're still 10 minutes out. 10 minutes was an eternity in a firefight. Maria looked around at the wounded soldiers she was trying to keep alive and realized they didn't have 10 minutes. The Taliban ground forces were getting closer, and the next helicopter attack might finish off what was left of Alpha Company. That's when Private Johnson, the young soldier Maria had been treating back at the base that morning, did something that amazed everyone present. Despite his wounded leg, Johnson had somehow made his way up the mountain and was now crawling toward their position with a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile. "Johnson, what the hell are you doing here?" Martinez demanded.
"Heard you guys were having a party up here," Johnson replied with a grin. "Thought you might need some air defense." Johnson had borrowed a Stinger missile from the base weapons depot and somehow convinced one of the helicopter crews to drop him off at the base of the ridge. He had then climbed nearly 1,000 feet of rocky terrain on a wounded leg to reach Alpha Company's position. "Can you use that thing?" Maria asked, pointing at the missile launcher. "I qualified on Stingers last month," Johnson replied, "but I've never fired one in combat." The Taliban helicopters were turning for another attack run, and Maria could see fighters rappelling from ropes to positions that would allow them to attack Alpha Company from multiple directions. They were about to be completely surrounded. "Johnson, if you're going to shoot that thing, now would be a good time," Martinez said. Johnson struggled to get into a firing position, hampered by his wounded leg and the need to stay behind cover. Maria helped him brace the missile launcher on a rock outcropping that would give him a clear shot at the approaching helicopters. "Remember, lead the target," she told him. "That helicopter is moving fast." Johnson nodded and tracked the lead Taliban helicopter through the missile sights. The aircraft was about 800 meters away and closing rapidly, its door gunner already firing at their position. Johnson squeezed the trigger. The Stinger missile leaped from its launcher with a roar, leaving a trail of white smoke as it streaked toward the helicopter. For a moment, it looked like the missile would miss, passing behind the aircraft's tail rotor. Then the Stinger's seeker had acquired the helicopter's engine heat signature and adjusted course. The explosion lit up the afternoon sky as the missile struck the helicopter's engine compartment. The aircraft spun out of control and crashed into the valley below, taking its crew and the fighters it was carrying with it. The second Taliban helicopter immediately broke off its attack run and began climbing rapidly, trying to get out of range of any additional missiles. Johnson reached for another Stinger, but the remaining helicopter was already too far away for an effective shot. "Outstanding work, Johnson," Martinez yelled. "But we've still got ground forces closing in on 3 sides." Maria looked around their defensive perimeter and realized they were in serious trouble. The elimination of one helicopter had bought them some time, but Taliban fighters were still advancing up the slope from multiple directions. Alpha Company was down to less than a dozen effective soldiers, most of them wounded, and their ammunition was nearly exhausted. "Thunder 1, we need immediate extraction," Maria transmitted. "We can't hold this position much longer." "Roger, Santos. We're moving into position now. But we need you to clear a landing zone. The area where you are now is too rocky for the helicopters to land." Maria studied the terrain around their position. About 50 meters to the east, there was a small flat area that might be large enough for a helicopter to touch down briefly. The problem was that reaching it would require crossing open ground under fire from Taliban positions. "Martinez, we need to move to that flat area," Maria said, pointing toward the potential landing zone. "Can your people provide covering fire?" "With what ammunition?" Martinez replied grimly. "Most of us are down to our last magazine." Maria made another decision that would have horrified any military commander. She stood up in full view of the Taliban fighters and began waving her arms. "What are you doing, Doc?" Williams demanded. "Getting their attention," Maria replied calmly. The Taliban fighters immediately began concentrating their fire on Maria's position exactly as she had intended. While they were focused on shooting at her, the wounded soldiers began moving toward the landing zone under cover of the distraction. Bullets cracked past Maria's head as she dove behind a rock outcropping, but her plan was working. Martinez was already helping Collins and Williams move toward the flat area, while Johnson provided what covering fire he could with his limited ammunition. The sound of American helicopters approached from the northeast just as Maria had suggested earlier. 2 Blackhawks appeared over the ridgeline, flying fast and low to avoid ground fire. The lead aircraft immediately began taking fire from Taliban positions, but the pilot continued his approach to the improvised landing zone. "Thunder 1, this is Santos. Landing zone has wounded personnel moving into position. You'll have about 30 seconds on the ground before the hostiles can reposition to engage." "Copy, Santos. We see your people moving. Tell them to be ready for immediate pickup." The first Black Hawk touched down in the flat area, its rotors still turning as the crew chief jumped out to help load casualties.
Maria stayed in her exposed position, continuing to draw fire away from the evacuation site.
More bullets cracked past her, one close enough to tug at her uniform sleeve. Martinez and Johnson helped the walking wounded into the helicopter while the crew chief loaded the more seriously injured soldiers.
It was taking longer than the 30 seconds Maria had estimated, and Taliban fighters were beginning to move to positions where they could fire at the landing zone. "Thunder 1, you need to get out of there now," Maria transmitted. "They're getting ready to hit you with everything they've got." Just as the crew chief signaled that all casualties were loaded, a rocket-propelled grenade streaked toward the helicopter. The pilot reacted instantly, lifting off just as the RPG exploded where the aircraft had been sitting moments before. The first Black Hawk climbed rapidly, carrying 8 wounded soldiers to safety, but Maria and 4 other members of Alpha Company were still on the ridge, and the second helicopter was taking heavy fire as it tried to approach for pickup. "Thunder 2, abort your approach," Maria radioed. "The landing zone is too hot. Negative, Santos. We're not leaving anyone behind." The second Black Hawk came in fast and low, its door gunners returning fire at Taliban positions. But as the aircraft flared to land, a machine gun opened up from a concealed position on the ridge above them. Bullets stitched across the helicopter's fuselage, and Maria could see smoke beginning to pour from the engine compartment. The pilot managed to get the aircraft on the ground, but it was clear that it wouldn't be flying again anytime soon. The crew chief was already on the radio, calling for emergency backup, while his door gunners continued firing at Taliban positions. Maria realized that instead of rescuing the last members of Alpha Company, the second helicopter had just become another group of people who needed to be rescued. They now had 4 helicopter crew members stranded on the ridge along with Maria and the remaining soldiers. The sound of jet engines overhead announced the arrival of the F-16 fighters that had been called in to provide air support. But the Taliban ground forces were so close to the American position that the jets couldn't use their weapons without risking friendly fire casualties. Maria looked at the damaged helicopter, the exhausted soldiers, and the Taliban fighters who were closing in from all sides. They were trapped on a mountainside in Afghanistan with no way out and no hope of rescue. It should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was the moment when Maria Santos proved that sometimes the impossible is just another word for necessary. Maria stared at the smoking helicopter and the 9 people who were now depending on her to keep them alive. The aircraft's pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Jenkins, was trying to restart the damaged engine, while his co-pilot worked frantically with the radio equipment. The 2-door gunners had taken defensive positions around the aircraft, but their ammunition wouldn't last long against a determined attack. "Doc, what's the plan?" Corporal Martinez asked. His broken arm was getting worse, and she could see pain etched in his face despite the morphine she had given him. Maria looked around the ridge, studying the terrain with new eyes. They couldn't stay where they were. The Taliban fighters would overrun their position within minutes. They couldn't be rescued by helicopter because the landing zone was too dangerous. And they couldn't retreat down the mountain because enemy forces controlled all the approach routes. That left only one option that no sane person would consider. "We're going up," Maria announced. "Up where?" Martinez asked, following her gaze toward the peak of the ridge that rose another 200 feet above their current position. "To the top. There's an old communications station up there that was abandoned years ago. If we can reach it, we'll have better defensive positions, and the F-16s can provide close air support without worrying about hitting us." Jenkins looked up from the helicopter's engine compartment. "Santos, that climb would be difficult for healthy soldiers with full equipment. We've got wounded people and limited ammunition. Do you have a better idea?" Maria asked. Jenkins considered their situation for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I don't." Maria began organizing the group for movement. Martinez and Williams could walk despite their wounds, and Johnson was managing to get around on his injured leg. The helicopter crew was uninjured but had only their personal weapons and limited ammunition. It wasn't much of a force to fight their way up a mountainside, but it was what they had to work with. She distributed what little medical supplies remained among the group and made sure everyone understood the plan. They would move in pairs, with stronger individuals helping the wounded. Maria would take point, using her knowledge of combat medicine to assess the physical condition of the group and set a pace they could maintain. "Remember, we're not trying to win a battle up there," Maria told them. "We're just trying to survive long enough for real help to arrive." The sound of automatic weapons fire was getting closer as Taliban fighters worked their way up the slope toward their position. Maria could see movement in the rocks below, indicating that the enemy was preparing for a final assault on the ridge. "Time to go," she announced. The group began climbing toward the peak, moving as quickly as possible given their physical limitations. Maria stayed at the front, occasionally stopping to help boost wounded soldiers over particularly difficult terrain. The abandoned communication station was barely visible through the rocks and scrub vegetation that covered the upper slopes. Behind them, Taliban fighters reached the helicopter and began searching the area where Alpha Company had been positioned. It wouldn't take them long to figure out which direction the Americans had gone, and then they would begin pursuit. The climb was agony for everyone involved. Martinez's broken arm made it nearly impossible for him to maintain his balance on the steep slope. Williams's leg wound had reopened and was bleeding through his bandages. Johnson was pushing himself far beyond what his injured leg should have been able to handle. After 30 minutes of climbing, they were still only halfway to the communication station. Maria could hear voices below them, speaking in Pashto and getting closer. The Taliban fighters had found their trail and were following it up the mountain. "We need to move faster," Maria told the group during a brief rest stop. "Doc, I don't think Williams can go much faster," Martinez replied. "His leg is pretty torn up." Maria looked at Williams, who was trying to hide how much pain he was in. The sergeant was a tough soldier, but he was losing blood and strength with every step. She made a decision that went against every principle of military tactics she had ever learned. "Martinez, Johnson, you help Williams. I'm going back down to slow down our pursuit." "You're not going anywhere alone, Doc," Martinez said firmly. "We stick together. If those fighters catch up to us on this slope, they'll kill all of us," Maria replied. "But if someone can delay them for even 10 minutes, the rest of you can reach the station and set up a defensive position." Before anyone could argue further, Maria was already heading back down the slope, moving from cover to cover. She had one remaining smoke grenade, a few bandages, and her sidearm with 3 rounds left. It wasn't much to work with, but it would have to be enough. She found a position behind a large boulder about 100 meters below where she had left the others. From here, she could see the Taliban fighters making their way up the slope, spread out in a loose formation that suggested they were being cautious about possible ambushes. Maria counted at least 12 fighters, all armed with automatic rifles, and carrying plenty of ammunition. Under normal circumstances, a single American soldier with limited weapons would have no chance against such a force. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Maria wasn't planning to fight a conventional battle. She pulled out her smoke grenade and threw it into the path the Taliban fighters were following. Dense gray smoke immediately began obscuring their vision and forcing them to slow their advance. While they were distracted by the smoke, Maria fired her 3 remaining rounds at the rocks above their position, not trying to hit anyone but creating the impression that they were facing a larger force. The Taliban fighters immediately took cover and began firing wildly into the smoke, wasting ammunition on targets they couldn't see. Maria used the noise to cover her movement as she relocated to a different position further up the slope. For the next several minutes, she played a deadly game of hide-and-seek with the pursuing fighters. Every time they tried to advance, she would throw rocks to create noise in a different location, making them think they were facing multiple opponents. When they fired at one of these false positions, she would move again, always staying ahead of them, but close enough to delay their progress. The strategy was working, but Maria knew it couldn't last much longer. She was running out of places to hide, and the Taliban fighters were beginning to spread out in a wider search pattern that would eventually locate her real position. That's when she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. The roar of jet engines diving toward the mountainside. "Thunder control. This is Viper lead," came a voice over the radio frequency. "I have visual on hostile forces pursuing American personnel up the ridge. Request permission to engage." "Viper lead, this is Thunder control. You are cleared hot. Friendlies are marked by smoke at the communication station." Maria looked up toward the peak and saw purple smoke rising from the old communication station, indicating that the rest of the group had reached their destination safely. The F-16s could now attack the Taliban fighters without risking friendly fire. "All American personnel on the ridge take cover immediately," the pilot transmitted. "Danger, close fire mission inbound." Maria pressed herself against the boulder as the first fighter jet screamed overhead, its cannon firing 20 mm rounds into the Taliban positions below. The sound was deafening, and the impacts threw dirt and rock fragments high into the air. Several Taliban fighters were caught in the open and didn't survive the strafing run. The second F-16 followed immediately, dropping cluster bombs that exploded across the lower slopes of the ridge. The few Taliban fighters who survived the initial attacks began retreating down the mountain, abandoning their pursuit of the Americans. Maria waited until the jets finished their attack runs before emerging from cover. The mountainside below her looked like a battlefield from World War I, covered with smoke and debris from the airstrikes. The immediate threat was over, but they were still stranded on a mountaintop, in hostile territory. She began climbing toward the communications station, where she could see the rest of the group waving to indicate their position. Her ankle was now swollen to twice its normal size, making every step painful, but she forced herself to keep moving. When she reached the station, Martinez helped her up the last few meters of rocky slope. "Doc, you are completely insane," he said with a grin. "But I'm glad you're on our side." The old communications station consisted of several concrete buildings that provided excellent defensive positions. Jenkins had managed to establish radio contact with FOB Thunder and was coordinating their eventual extraction. The F-16s continued to circle overhead, ready to engage any Taliban forces that attempted another assault. "How long until pickup?" Maria asked.
30 minutes, Jenkins replied. "They're sending a full air assault package this time. 4 Black Hawks with Apache escort."
Maria sat down heavily against one of the concrete walls and finally allowed herself to feel the full extent of her injuries.
Her ankle was definitely broken. She had cuts and bruises over most of her body, and she was completely exhausted, but everyone was alive. Williams looked at his bandaged leg and then at Maria. "Doc, I've got a question for you." "What's that, Sergeant?" "When we get back to base, are you going to put me on light duty for this leg wound?" Maria laughed despite everything they had been through. "Williams, after today, I think you've earned some light duty. Good, because I was planning to note this for at least 2 weeks." The sound of helicopters approaching from the south announced the arrival of their rescue force. 4 Black Hawks appeared over the valley, escorted by 2 Apache gunships that immediately began scanning the area for threats. The lead transport helicopter landed at the communications station and its crew chief jumped out to help load the wounded. As Maria was helped into the helicopter, she looked back at the mountainside where they had fought for their lives. In a few hours, it would be quiet again, just another piece of Afghan terrain that had witnessed too much violence. But for now, it was the place where 9 Americans had refused to give up, even when giving up was the only logical option. The helicopter lifted off and began flying toward FOB Thunder. Maria closed her eyes and thought about her grandmother Esperanza, who had always said that God put people exactly where they needed to be. Maybe she had been right after all. 3 weeks later, Maria Santos was awarded the Medal of Honor for her actions on the ridge. The citation read in part, "Staff Sergeant Santos displayed extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for her own safety in order to save the lives of her fellow soldiers." But Maria knew the real story was simpler than that. Sometimes when people you care about are in trouble, you jump out of the helicopter. Everything else is just details. She jumped from the helicopter into the hot zone and turned the battle on its head.